Lord, we thank you for this time here that we can look into your scriptures, and especially today to see Passover. May we look at you as a God of deliverance who rescues us when we need your help, which is every day. Amen.
Amen.
So today we are going to finish up the plagues, and we're going to look at Passover. So that's what all of these different foods are. It's some of the different kind of traditional Passover foods. And then this is the chart that I lost last week when I tried to print it. But this is, of all the little summaries of the 10 plagues, this one is my favorite because it has a nice little picture for looking at each of them, and it has the scripture reference. So if you're, a couple months from now and you go, man, what was that other plague? You can pull this out of your purse and look it up, and it will have there the scripture reference for it. Is my mouse connected?
That's it. Are we to keep these?
Yes, these are yours to keep.
Oh, nice. A plague for everybody.
Everyone gets a plague. So as we are working our way through the book of Exodus, so we've been following this outline, and today we're at chapters 10 through 13, which is known as Come. And it's going to be the last plagues and the Passover. And I'm always surprised when I reread Exodus, because it's not a book I spend a lot of time reading, how much detailed and ritual there was. And I don't know, was I the only one that was surprised by that? Looking through this, all the scripted ritual?
Yes.
Like chapters 12 and 13, I never realized, and it's very repetitive over and over again about what they are supposed to do. And so we said this at the beginning, but the story of the Exodus and then the festival of Passover, it's one of the most important stories for lots of communities around the world. And it's true for Jewish communities. The Exodus and this Passover marks kind of the foundation of their story. And so it's hopefully we'll get to see a glimpse of that as we'll look at some of these parts. I always want to come back to this part in Exodus 3 and 4 when Moses is at that burning bush and God is calling on him to go out and to speak. And he says those four things. I'm unworthy. I don't know your name, so I don't even know what to tell people about you. God gives him an answer. And he says, well, people won't even listen. And God's like, yes, they will. And he's like, well, I can't even speak that well. And I still have speak spelled wrong on it. So he can't even spell wrong correctly either. And this story is just important to me because I feel like those four things are ones we always struggle with ourselves. But God calls all of us. And if he can use Moses, he can use you. And I want to look back at last week because we started with the first section in Exodus 6 and 7 when God reaches out to the Israelites and they are at the bottom of the bottom. They've spent over 400 years here in Egypt as slaves, and their spirits are completely broken. And even Moses' spirit is broken. But God says, I'm still going to send you and use you and do a great thing. And here we're going to see God's renewal of this covenant. It's happening through Moses and through Israel, and we're going to see it displayed in the Exodus that we're going to see today. So here's our 10 plagues with our handy-dandy sheets. You keep this in your pocket. If you ever forget the plagues, you can pull it out and you can look at it. And I just want to reiterate, and I like this other version of it where it's set up vertically. And we looked at this last week, but the plagues are poetic in the way that they're structured. So there's 3 sets of 3 plagues. And then there's kind of the ultimate plague within the Passover. And so the first set of 3 is special because the one doing the action is Aaron's staff. So his staff is the one that touches the Nile and turns it to blood. The second set is special because God is working directly. So God tells Moses and Aaron he's going to do these things, and they go and they give Pharaoh a warning, but there's no other actor. God is the actor. And then in the third set, this is the one that's Moses' hand And the other part with these is they're all escalating in intensity. So the first set of 3 is all of the Egyptians and all of the Israelites. And the magicians of Pharaoh are able to repeat this set of 3. The second set of 3, though, it only affects the Egyptians, not the Israelites. And so now we're saying not only is there power and it's repeatable, but it is Yahweh that's the source of power, because it's only affecting the Egyptians, not the Israelites. And then this last set of 3, the Egyptians aren't even present for it because they've become unclean in those boils. So they were ceremonially unclean. They couldn't do any more rituals. And this is the one that's going to cause death and harm. And so there's this escalation in all of it. And with this third set of 3, what we're going to see is that there's always ample warning before the harm comes. The first ones are scary, but they're not harmful. These ones are harmful, and they do cause death. But there's warning, and there's even a way out, if you will, for the Egyptians. So like if we saw last week when the hail comes, they were told that they could hide inside as well. And what we saw last week as well is that when the hail comes, and remember it turns into fire and it burns, it only affects the plants that make the clothes and that were used in potions for like religious ceremonies. It did not affect any of the food. And in the text, there's a very clear distinction on what plants were affected. It's not what they ate. It was only what they would use for other things. And there was this picture I really liked of it. So here's the hail falling down. It turns into fire. And remember, Pharaoh is supposed to be the chief protector of the Egyptians. That was his divine role. And he is forsaking that role and letting everyone else get hurt. But it doesn't really affect Pharaoh. He's still up in his palace doing whatever pharaohs do all day, while everyone else is suffering. And so the picture that we're getting is that this is like an ego battle, and Pharaoh doesn't really care for the Egyptians that he's supposed to care for. Any questions on last week's material? Okay, well, this won't let me go back, so I won't go back to that picture. The other part that we looked at last week is after each plague, we looked at kind of the Egyptian god that it related to. And what we saw is that all of the plagues actually work their way up the Egyptian gods. And they're kind of working their way to bigger and bigger Egyptian gods. And so what we're really seeing in the plagues is this battle of the gods themselves. And the other part we looked at, it was an undoing of creation itself. So the very first plague that starts with the Nile, with the water, one of the very first acts of creation God does is separate the waters. And so it's kind of this display. God's like, if you don't want to live in my good world, here's what happens when I'm not a part of it. And uncreation takes place. And that's what we saw kind of with the plagues. It was almost walking through Genesis 1 and 2 with the creation story. And this is how we ended, is that the plagues are a display of Yahweh's power, but they're also a display of mercy. Because the plagues weren't there to punish the Egyptians. They were there to show the Egyptians who the true God was. And so it's an act of almost rescuing the Egyptians from these false gods. And it gives them space for repentance to turn to the true God, to Yahweh. Okay, does that all make sense? No more questions about last week? Oh, there is ample food for you to grab. So that brings us here into Exodus 10. And this, remember, it's the second plague in the last third set. So plague number 8. And this is the plague of the locust. And so once again, and it's all the same pattern that we're going to see over and over again, Moses and Aaron approach Pharaoh and they ask to be let go. Oh, before I say this, I want to call us back. Remember that plague before with the hail? What plants did it affect?
Clothing.
Their clothing. Did it affect their food plants? No. This one will. And so this is a pretty big step in escalation. And so Moses and Aaron, they're before Pharaoh. They're demanding that they be let go. And God is going to warn Pharaoh through Moses and Aaron what's about to happen. And that is that this plague of locusts are going to come. By the way, this picture is a real locust plague. This was in Africa in 2020. So there was a big locust plague that if COVID hadn't have happened, probably would have been the headline of the year. And so this is an actual picture, like from a real camera. And those are real locusts. I just want to point that out. And so this is the warning that these locusts are going to come. And in the story, it says that this wind comes out of the east. And it's like they've come out of the Red Sea and they're blown over into Egypt. When they go away, there's a wind from the west and it kind of blows them back out into the ocean. For a lot of ancient people, the ocean represents chaos. And so this is like death coming out of that chaos. Again, it's an undoing of creation. And so Pharaoh's officials are like, Pharaoh, you need to listen and you need to let the people go. And so Pharaoh at first, well, this is in the next one. And so Pharaoh doesn't listen. He doesn't let the people go. And so what happens now, Moses stretches up his staff, and this swarm of locusts comes, and it eats all of the plants. And so before, there was still food for the Egyptian economy. Now there is nothing. This is a complete devastation of all of Egypt. And so Pharaoh says, I have sinned against your God. Please, beg your God to have forgiveness for me. And so Moses does. He prays for forgiveness. The wind comes, blows the locusts back into the ocean. And then yet again, now we have Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he does not let the people go. And so God gives this other warning about the next plague that's going to come. And again, we're going to see it escalate more and more. And so this God is the god Seth. Sometimes it's spelled Set. He was the god of of war, storms, and disorder, and the god of chaos. And Set or Seth is a pretty big deal. Sometimes he is seen as like the evil side, where Horus is the good side. And they're kind of like brothers, or he's an uncle. It's kind of all a little bit confusing. But he's not a good god, but he is a very powerful god. And so this is tackling one of the highest in all of the pantheon for the Egyptians. And then we're going to come to the rest of Exodus 10, and that's the plague of darkness. And so this is the 9th plague. This is kind of the pinnacle before we get to the Passover, or the death of the firstborns. And so in this one, God brings this darkness over all the land. And the darkness is so thick, people can't even light a candle and see in front of them. And it lasts for 3 whole days. And it says the darkness was not just a physical darkness, it was like you could feel the darkness, that it was so dark. And so we get this idea, it's more than a physical, it's a spiritual darkness as well. And it lasts for 3 days. And it's a big darkness. But it's only over the Egyptians. It's not in the land of Goshen. It's not where the Israelites are. And so, and the Israelites can see when they light their own candles, and they can walk about and still see. What's kind of special about this, oftentimes darkness will represent spiritual realities. And so it's almost like it's showing the darkness of the Egyptians, their spiritual darkness or their spiritual death. And so where the Israelites have this kind of light from God, they have this spiritual light. And so it's showing us kind of that in the darkness. The other part to know is... let me come back to this slide, because the other part to know is that Ra is essentially the chief of the pantheon, of the Egyptian pantheon. He is essentially the chief god. And so Ra is the sun god. And so for the darkness to come, for God to show power over the sun, it is in every way possible saying all of the Egyptian gods are dead. They have no power because Ra is the one who rides across the sky in his chariot, dragging the sun each morning. So it's a very scary display, and it really does show. That none of the Egyptian gods have power because their chief god has no power. By the way, you can buy this nice wall decoration on Etsy of this picture, and I'm kind of tempted to hang it up in my office because it's a nice big piece that you can hang up.
It's a face. There's 2 eyes, a nose, and the boat is a mouth. It's like a bird.
Yeah. It's kind of, he has the face of I think it's a falcon.
But I mean, there's 2 eyes, the top, the big red ball is the nose, and
Yeah.
then the boat is the
And
mouth.
a lot of the Egyptian gods, whatever their domain is, will have it over their head. And there's some kind of animal hybrid. And so here's the sun over his head. It does look like a face, though. I feel like it should be more scary, though, not smiling. The other part is after this kind of happens. So Pharaoh is going to summon Moses and Aaron back to the court. And they're going to demand that the Israelites can go again. And so here Pharaoh almost concedes. He says, I'll let your men go. But you have to leave the animals. Because at this point, the Egyptian economy is devastated. There is nothing left. And so Pharaoh says, leave your animals. But Moses says, no, I have to take the animals too, because we have to use it for a sacrifice for Yahweh out in the desert. And so Pharaoh says, no. And then Moses gives a warning of what's about to happen. And Pharaoh just says, let it be. And so we really get this idea he is not doing his duty of taking care of the Egyptians. And now he's just kind of mad and having a temper tantrum. And because thus far, nothing has really affected Pharaoh directly. And that's going to get us into the next plague. Before we move on, any questions about the other plagues?
Well, it's not necessarily about the plagues, but what I don't understand in reading is, was this God's plan, or was just Pharaoh just dumb, thinking this is not going to happen?
So,
and it does. So,
from the very beginning, God says, I'm going to do a work that's going to show my power as God.
okay.
And so you get both ideas, I think. So on the one hand, throughout this whole account, because through half the plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And you get there is chance and chance and chance and chance for them to turn to Yahweh. But then you get kind of past the point where they won't listen unless something devastating happens. And so I think you get both ideas in there. But there is chance and chance and chance. This didn't have to happen, I think is the idea that you get. It didn't have to be this way.
What is the differentiation between the Pharaoh's heart being hardened versus God hardening Pharaoh's heart?
Yeah.
Is there still a chance for redemption even after God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Because it would seem to me that would be a process that would be hard to undo.
The way that I look at it, and so at first Pharaoh is hardening his own heart. Mm-hmm. So he's saying, I won't let you do this thing. And eventually God says, okay, I'll give you over to what you have done to yourself. And so there is still chances, even because each time, once the last set of 3, they have a whole day before where he says, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. You have 24 hours. And he doesn't turn. And so to me, at first God's really, really working on him. And then he says, fine, I'll let you be what you want to be. Not that you can't turn, but now he's seeing he's hardened himself so much, it's almost like there's not much left. There's a really good book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce. Has anyone read that book? If you haven't read it, it's really worth reading. But I really love the way that it ends, and it's kind of it's a thought experiment, if you will, about the human condition and what it means to, with heaven and hell and what happens after death. And one of the ways he writes about it is that when people are in the afterlife, those that are in hell, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until their humanity is so gone that they kind of wisp away into non-existence. And I think that's a really powerful metaphor for thinking about what it is like when we reject our own humanity and God reaching to us. We're actually becoming less human until there's not much left of us anymore.
What's the name of that book?
The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. It's a really great book. So it's not as much a theology piece as it is like a moral analysis of ourselves, but it does a really good job at it. I get nervous when I think about a forceful God. And so the way I think about this is God giving him over. But there would be others that would disagree with me.
Well, there's the element of choice.
Yeah.
And that's big. I mean, they don't have a choice. We have a choice.
Yeah.
People have a choice. The difference in conscription and well,
yeah.
you know, we can choose, and that's big.
Yeah.
You know?
I think especially in the Episcopal Church, there's more of a focus on our choice, where some other churches focus more on God's direction or directing.
Predestination.
Yeah, and election and type thing. So
Free will.
where we have more of a free will type focus, but you're getting both ideas in Scripture, and they're there to balance each other out. But I lean more toward, I feel more comfortable in the free will kind of camp. But it's also comforting to know that there's a God that can act and do big things in the world. And so you need both sides. And I think you get both sides here.
The other thing that strikes me is everything that was predicted happened. So why didn't Pharaoh believe that the next one was coming? It seems like
Because he didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in
but he saw the result of what was
Well,
happening.
that was just coincidence.
Oh, I see. I guess that's one explanation.
The Pharaoh in the story is selfish. He is the picture of a selfish king that doesn't care for others. Because any good, reasonable person would be like, oh, yeah, obviously this guy's going to win. If I cared for my people, I would.
So the point is that he didn't care for them until, not that he did at that point, until it affected him directly.
Yes, yeah. And we're going to see, and not just Pharaoh's firstborn dies, but Pharaoh was the firstborn of Ra. It was this plague is an attack on Pharaoh's power itself. And so, he never actually cares for other people. And then eventually he sends, all the army to their death. And so, the Pharaoh in this story is the picture of the king who doesn't care. And the king really should be the one who cares the most. And so, yeah, this is good discussion. I like this. But I also want to hold on to that balance of the free will and God acting. Because they're both there. So now we're going to come into... Oh, my picture didn't change. Okay, well, this should have it. I think my new picture is on the other sides. So in Exodus 11, we're going to see the plague on the firstborn. And so this is the one that the Passover is based on. And so, again, God has given this warning that this next plague is going to come. And so God instructs all of the Israelites to gather up all the gold, the silver, anything valuable from all of the Egyptians. Because they know they're getting ready to leave. And all of the Egyptians just give over everything, which seems kind of confusing. And so Moses then delivers this message after God's told him to. So then you see it happen. God says it's going to happen, then Moses does it, and everyone listens, and then you read about that happening. There is a question about this that was asked a few weeks ago that I'm going to answer. So let me skip this video. Okay, so this was a question from some of our online watchers that aren't here right now. But it's related to why they give away all their gold. So this was the question. In Exodus 3:21 through 3:22, God says at the end to plunder the Egyptians and puts the jewelry and clothing on your sons and daughters. How can the Jews, who are in the minority, do this, And why would the Egyptians let them have all their gold and their silver? So this was emailed in a few weeks ago, and I answered it a few weeks ago, but I wanted to share it with all of you now that it's happening in the story. So I have 3 answers to this question. The first part, in the story, the Hebrews are not the minority. And so if you remember when Exodus starts, they multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And we looked at that account in Numbers. It said there was 600,000 men in the Exodus, which would be about 2 million people or more. And so we kind of get the idea that there might even be more Hebrews than all of the Egyptians. Even if it wasn't 2 million people near your capital is enough to listen to. 2 million mad people can make a pretty big mess. And the other part with this is that this is a big battle of the gods. And so what we have been reading about and unfolding, we have seen that the Egyptians have no power, but the Israelites do. And so one way of looking at this, it's almost like a peace offering. So they're like paying off the Israelites for protection is part of what you see. And the other part, and where I think this might be more important, is if you've had people that are slaves for 400 years with no riches, the next question is, how do they have this tabernacle a generation later that is built within its millions of pounds of gold in the descriptions that are given about the tabernacle? And so one question you need to come up with, if you're going to have a tabernacle and soon you're going to have a temple, where did they get all their gold and silver from? And so this is answering that question. They took it from the Egyptians. So I wanted to answer this question. Does that make sense? Kind of?
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't? Okay.
So what you're saying, no, go ahead.
So I was wondering if maybe God told the Egyptians to give it up. It's awfully hard to give up the riches. So they needed to have some incentive or some kind of push in them to give it up. Because why wouldn't they say, no, we're keeping them ourselves?
I mean, the slaves are the one. I mean, they're saying slaves took our stuff. That doesn't make sense.
Were they buying protection though?
Yeah, they have just lost all of their animals, all of their fields.
Okay.
Then, they have lost everything. And so the next question is, am I about to die? My gold's not very valuable to me if I'm about to die. And so, and what we're seeing, the common folk of the Egyptians are in part, they're open to what Yahweh is doing. They were the ones hiding. Some of them even are going to paint the blood over their house posts and things like that. So they are recognizing the God of Israel as being powerful. And so a lot of it is, to me, it's like this peace offering. But you're also, in the story, you have to explain how these people get so much gold.
I wouldn't call it peace. I'd call it extortion.
We're trying to stay a little positive. Okay. I wanted to answer that because it does a good question. It doesn't make sense that much. So I wanted to answer that. We're going to finish this video from about the plagues. There's only 3 minutes of it left. It's just going to explain these other ones. And then we're going to work our way through that, the Passover.
Well, that was a doozy.
What was the meaning and purpose of the storm god? This hail was unlike any that had been seen before. It was accompanied by a fire which ran along the ground, and every Israelite would be able to tell their children of the things they had seen God do in Egypt and how it showed them God's power. The 8th plague, locusts, again focused on Nut, Osiris, and Set. The later crops, wheat and rye, which had survived the hail, were now devoured by swarms of locusts. There would be no harvest in Egypt that year. The 9th plague, darkness, was aimed at the sun god, Re, who was symbolized by Pharaoh himself. For 3 days, the land of Egypt was smothered by an unearthly darkness, but the homes of the Israelites had light. The 10th and last plague, the death of the firstborn males, was a judgment on Isis, the protector of children. In this plague, God was teaching the Israelites a deep spiritual lesson that pointed to Christ. Unlike the other plagues, which the Israelites survived by virtue of their identity as God's people, this plague required an act of faith by them. God commanded each family to take an unblemished male lamb and kill it. The blood of the lamb was to be smeared on the top and sides of the doorways, and the lamb was to be roasted and eaten that night. Any family that did not follow God's instructions would suffer in the last plague. God described how he would send the destroyer through the land of Egypt, which orders to slay the firstborn male of every household, whether human or animal. The only protection was the blood of the lamb on the door. When the destroyer saw the blood, he would pass over that house and leave it untouched. This is where the term Passover comes from. Passover is a memorial of that night in ancient Egypt when God delivered his people from bondage. 1 Corinthians 5:7 teaches that Jesus became our Passover when he died to deliver us from the bondage of sin. While the Israelites found God's protection in their homes, every other home in the land of Egypt experienced God's wrath as their loved ones died. This grievous event caused Pharaoh to finally release the Israelites. By the time the Israelites left Egypt, they had a clear picture of God's power, God's protection, and God's plan for them. For those who were willing to believe, they had convincing evidence that they served the true and living God. Sadly, many still failed to believe, which led to other trials and lessons by God. The result for the Egyptians and the other ancient people of the region was a dread of the God of Israel. Even after the 10th plague, Pharaoh once again hardened his heart and sent his chariots after the Israelites. When God opened a way through the Red Sea for the Israelites and drowned all of Pharaoh's armies there, the power of Egypt was crushed, and the fear of God.
That's farther than I wanted to go. Okay. So what we're going to see begin to happen is this Passover one. And that was our online question. Okay. So here's my other picture. So I hope this picture looks familiar to you. This is where they are painting that blood over the doorpost. You know this story, right? You've heard this story before. Does it still make you uncomfortable to hear? Good. It should make you uncomfortable to hear this story. This should not sit comfortably with you. And we might not explore that too much in here, but this is not a happy story. This is a sad, scary story. The other picture that I had that didn't show up, it was someone holding a cartoon kid and they were crying out. I'm not sure why it didn't load in here, but maybe it's hidden somewhere else in my slides. So the instructions that they are given is to take a lamb and put it in their home for 14 days. Who here has a pet? How long did it take you to get attached to that pet? When you brought it home?
Not long.
Would you say in less than 2 weeks you had named it and got attached to it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I want to point this out. Bringing a lamb inside your house, you're going to get attached to it emotionally. People have always liked animals. And so a little cute baby lamb living in your house, you're going to get attached to it. So after 2 weeks, then they slaughter it. And then they take that blood and they're going to put it over the doorpost. This is to represent sacrifice. And all of this story, the different parts, hopefully make us uncomfortable. Because this isn't a happy ending. Kind of the way the plagues have happened, God didn't want it to play out this way. But this is the way it had to for this result to happen. It's the only way that the Israelites could go. And the Israelites needed to get out of Egypt because they were there to bless the whole world. But this isn't a picture of that blessing. And so it's a sad thump in the story. When people are selfish and aren't good, bad things happen. And so in this, the family is going to have this ritual meal together. I feel like it happens like 3 different times because God tells them about it, then it happens, and then he tells them, now remember that thing that you did, and this is how you remember it. It is repeated a lot in what we read. And then there's all this stuff about the unleavened bread, which Marcia, I think, did you ask about that when you walked in? Okay. Who here likes baking? Okay, when you bake, what is it time consuming to bake?
Yes.
What is the biggest time part in baking?
Yeah, the bread rises.
Yeah, you're waiting for the bread to rise. The picture of something being unleavened is I didn't have enough time for it to rise. And so the significance of unleavened bread here is that it was made quickly. And so that there is some flatbread here. You'll notice it's not poofy. Poofy bread is really nice. Flatbread is thick and not the most enjoyable to eat all the time. And so that's the significance here. they were expecting to leave. And so they're eating the unleavened bread because they're expecting that they're getting ready to leave. And so if you've ever eaten dinner together as a family and you have your shoes on because you know you have to leave to get somewhere, it's kind of like that. They're ready to go, so they're rushing through the meal.
But at one point they said even if there was leftover leavened bread, they weren't to eat it.
Yeah, because it's a ritual, the ritual meal.
Ritual.
Yeah, which we're gonna.
That's wasteful to me. If it's there and it's ready, why not?
You know, I guess we are like our Eucharist in some aspects is wasteful. If you've ever, I've been in churches where they have the fresh bread at the end of the service. You throw it outside to the birds to eat.
We don't waste any of the.
Well, this church actually used to bake fresh bread for the services, and a lot of the church they go and scatter the bread because it's a sacred thing. And so then they are going to paint this blood over the doorpost, and that represents the Passover. So this angel of destruction that comes through.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah.
The destroyer.
The destroyer, again, makes you uncomfortable. It should make you uncomfortable. One day we'll have a fun discussion about Satan and Job in this class. And Satan is someone in God's court, God's divine court. And we're kind of seeing that same idea here. And then, again, he's going to tell the future generations how to remember this. And how do foreigners happen if they're in your home and things like that. And so one thing I want to point out, in this video they looked at this plague as being as Isis. But Pharaoh is the kind of ultimate god for the Egyptians. Like Ra is the head of the pantheon, but Pharaoh is the physical embodiment of Ra. He was considered a son of Ra and was the god kind of ruling the land itself. And so this death of the firstborn is a way of pointing fingers at Pharaoh and saying, you have no divine right to be Pharaoh. And so it's not just a stab like in that his son died, it's a stab to the position of Pharaoh itself. And all of these plagues have symbolic meanings. This one is attacking Pharaoh himself. Does that make sense, kind of words? Yeah. And so we're going to look now at some of the ritualistic meanings of this. I'm going to pass this sheet around. This is going to explain some of the different foods. But there's a couple different pieces that you include in a Seder meal. And before I explain that, and while this is passing around, there was a time when a lot of Christian churches would do Seder meals in their churches, and that became controversial between Christians and Jews because the Seder meal, as it is today with all of these parts, is a very important meal and ritual and celebration for Jewish communities. And so a lot of Christians read the Passover and then they would do the ritual Seder meal that didn't exist for like 1,000 more years after Christianity existed. And so even today in the Episcopal Church, some bishops have banned doing Seder meals in their parishes. And so before we look at this part, I want to just speak to, like, this is a very significant meal for a lot of Jews. And so a lot of Jewish communities will say, like, Christians are welcome to do a Seder meal, but come to our synagogue and do it. Don't go do it at your church.
How often is Seder?
They do it every year.
Just one time a year?
One time a year,
Passover.
yeah.
What's the date?
Passover.
But isn't that
Why
part
would that not be allowed?
Wait, hold on, sorry. There was like 3 questions. When the date, it is around Easter time. And then, because they're both based on the lunar calendars. Did you...
My question was, isn't that picking only certain parts of the Bible that we're going to follow or use?
If what?
The Seder. I mean, yes, it is in the Torah, but the Torah doesn't belong to the Jews. It belongs to
Yeah, so
all of us.
the Seder meal is based on this story, but the ritualistic part of all of these pieces developed thousands of years later, and it was after Christianity and Jews, like the Jewish community, were very separated. And so to a lot of Jewish community, it feels like they're stealing something that's theirs and special to them and twisting it because they Christianize it. And so for instance, there is 5 toasts that you give in the meal. And so a lot of Christians would add that last toast to be to Jesus or something. And so it's like they twisted and changed it, and instead of letting it be its own Jewish thing.
Would that be like the Jews celebrating Christmas, Jesus' birth?
You know,
One of their rituals?
when it comes to cultural appropriation, I'm going to step out of the argument and just state that there are some communities that are upset about it, so let's be respectful instead of getting too much in the weeds on that.
But there's a difference between cultural and sacred. You're saying the Jews feel that this is a sacred
some
ritual,
communities,
whereas
yeah.
Jews celebrating Christmas is just a cultural thing.
I guess that depends on where you live.
Alexander, the bishops that
No, I said Jews
prohibit-
celebrating Christmas.
Yeah.
the bishops that do not allow it in our church,
Uh,
are they talking about the distance of the time that went?
It comes to the respectfulness to Jewish communities primarily, because a lot of Jewish communities have been vocal, like you Christians should not do this because they're taking something that's ours and twisting it.
It was their historical event, a historic.
Yeah, and the traditions around it grew over centuries and centuries. That like Christianity and Judaism in the first century were very similar, but over centuries grew to be very, very different thing. And Judaism today is not like the Jews you read about in the Bible. It's very different. Just like, so are the Christians. People have grown. There was another question over here, I think.
Yeah, in Christian schools, they have a meal and teach it to the kids.
Yeah.
Is that wrong then?
I want to point out that it is a significant meal. I've done a Seder meal at my home before, and I did a Christian version of it. And I think it's important to learn about all the different parts and how it's important for Jews. But I just wanted to put that disclaimer before we move forward. So
I just have a hard time separating. Interesting. It's part of our tradition also. If it's here, is it not?
the Passover part is the Seder meal as it was is not a
So
Christian thing.
He's saying
I'm talking about but Genesis, Exodus, the Torah
Yeah.
is part of our tradition. It's part of us.
yes, but
Yeah.
the
No, I wasn't. But my question is it the Seder itself, or is it the stuff that has come afterwards that the Jewish community has built around that?
The second part, it's the Seder meal. Seder is Hebrew for order, or there might be a different way of saying it, but in English you say Seder meal. And we're going to watch a video on it. It is a service. In as much as when we do the Eucharist, there is a scripted, different motions. People read different parts. There's specific motions you do. There's a way that it's a scripted service. That usually happens in homes, or it could happen in the synagogue. But there's a specific way it happens and a meaning behind all the parts. And so I think the main thing is when we take it out of the context of what it is. So I wanted to say that before we look at these different parts as a disclaimer. So there's a couple different traditional pieces that go in the Seder meal. This sheet passing it around has more explanation, but one of those is the lamb bone. I don't have lamb, so this is chicken. And a lot of Jewish communities will actually use chicken because they don't have lamb where they're from. The other part is a type of flatbread that's more like a cracker that is called matzah. This is not matzah. This is just pita bread because it's what Kroger had. And then they would have a roasted egg. I like deviled eggs more, so I made deviled eggs. And then they would take bitter herbs and you dip them in salt water. So I would ask all of you to actually do that. I have parsley here and there's salt water. Do that and taste it. And that's to remind themselves of the bitterness of being in slavery. And so all of the different parts of the meal have different representations. Like this part, which I think is cool. This is Karaset or Charaset. It's apples and walnuts and wine with some spices and mixed together. And it was to remind them about making the bricks and all the different parts that make up the bricks. And then they would have a lettuce piece And then they have horseradish. I didn't think anyone would eat horseradish, so I did not get horseradish. But there's other parts that might go, like for different Jewish communities, they might have other elements as well. But if you go to like a Jewish store, you can buy a special plate that has all of these marked where all of they go. And just to remember that, I'm going to eat a little deviled egg.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
Isn't it also a Jewish tradition that you don't have milk and egg products on the same plate as meat?
That might
If
be.
you're kosher?
I feel like I do remember a part about not boiling the meat in the milk.
No, but it did say not boiling meat.
Oh.
Meat and cheese, you can't have together.
But I don't know.
But there's not milk in here.
There is, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
There's no dairy
There's
in.
no milk, there's no milk
In
in
that-
the eggs.
Well, if
Now, they
they
have-
have mayonnaise. it-
Well, they didn't put mayonnaise in.
A lot of Jewish communities will have deviled eggs. Like a lot of the Reformed Jews will actually have deviled eggs instead of a roasted egg. I wanted to show you all that, and then here's a quick video. This is like a Jewish evangelist explaining about a Seder meal. That I think she doesn't explain all the parts and their meaning, which is why I passed that sheet around, but she can explain it more than I can.
Passover Seder, or in American, Seders, come in many forms, from those filled with skits to those lasting all night to those rushed through in an effort to get to the food. Whatever your Seder, there are some symbols and customs you'll see most of the time. In the middle of the table, there's wine, a stack of matzah, and a cup of wine for Elijah the prophet, who's sent to visit every Seder. Additionally, there's the Seder plate. It can be anything from a fancy ceramic piece imported from Israel to a makeshift number hacked together from picnicware. On the Seder plate, a shank bone, egg, bitter herb, charoset, karpas, and a piece of lettuce. Each thing symbolizes a different aspect of Passover. Also, everyone has a Haggadah, the book or printouts that guides you through the Seder. There are tons of different Haggadahs. Minimal and elaborate, you can get them in Hebrew, English, or both, with any kind of commentary you like, from feminist to environmental to Hasidic to political. There are versions for kids, for interfaith groups, and for activists. And of course, people remix the tradition every which way to make it their own. Seder literally translates to order, so let's talk about that. There's a few traditions to start. Blessing the wine, washing your hands, dipping veggies into salt water, and then breaking the middle matzah. Half of it, called the afikoman, gets hidden surreptitiously. Then comes the main event, the telling of the Exodus from Egypt. Or more accurately, the main event is an interactive reading of rabbinical discussions about how to remember the Exodus. When the Seder was put together, the rabbis assumed everyone going in knew the story, so it was silly to just retell it. Instead, they went deeper, and in doing so, created a holiday that is about memory. How do people today relate to these themes of liberation and redemption? At many Seders, people go around the table and read a paragraph each from the Haggadah. People add songs and discussions about what happened back then and about parallels with today's world. Seders around the world may include diverse traditions like hitting your neighbor with green onions, pouring water on the floor, or pulling out a bag of plushy plates. And overachievers hold all-night Seders. One famous part of the Seder is the 4 questions, where the youngest child at the table asks, Ma nishtana? If you are the youngest child, you can practice here. Learning songs is a great way to prep for the Seder. If you have to pick one, make it the chorus to Dayenu. It's one word, and you can learn it here. After the storytelling piece, there's a few more customs. More hand-washing, eating matzah, then mabol, something bitter like horseradish, then a matzah mabor sandwich, and then dinner. If you're at a Sephardi Seder, there might be kitniot included. People's strenuousness about keeping kosher for Passover varies widely. For instance, some folks won't eat anything made with wet matzah, including the Passover staple, matzah balls. After the main meal and dessert, there's the search for the afikoman. Whoever finds it gets a prize, and everyone else gets the ability to finish the meal with a tiny piece of matzah. Now, just being honest, a lot of seders peter out here with tired kids and matzah kugel-induced food comas. But at a full seder, you continue with Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, followed by opening the door for Elijah, a special set of songs of praise called Mulled Wine, and the famous closeout, Next Year in Jerusalem. Then, 2 popular bonus songs are Echad Mi Yodea, and Chad Gadya. If you want to learn those, click over there. Haven't had enough of Seder yet? Lucky you. Outside of Israel, traditional Jews celebrate 2 nights of Seder, and there are lots of other variations out there. It's a quirky holiday. Chag Kasher Mesameach.
So I think, as you can tell, Seder meals are a lot more than what we read about in Exodus. And so there's a lot of hidden traditions, and in different parts of the world, as Jewish communities were spread about, they all developed their own different traditions as well. So it can be really diverse, but these things are the staple, and I hope you got to read this sheet with some of the significance. But my 2 favorites is the bitter herbs, remind them of the bitterness of oppression, and then the apples and walnut stuff, which is over here. So I made one without nuts because I can't eat nuts. And so those are both here, which I would encourage you to try. It is soaked in wine.
Well, you missed a treat. If you lived in New England, we'd have, that season, we'd have matzah with peanut butter.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You know, I thought, like, I usually have sunflower butter, and I just used the last of it this week. But I was, there was one recipe that wasn't as chunky, but it was one that was cooked. And I thought about doing that one, and then I decided not to. But they blend the walnuts into a paste, and then throw the apples in that, so it's like glued together. And it's supposed to be easier to spread. And then they kind of cook out some of the wine. So maybe that one's just more kid-friendly or something. Does that make sense, kind of with the significance of the Seder meal? So, and I hope after watching this, it makes sense that this is thousands of years of traditions grown after, like, the Exodus. And so it is different than a Christian thing. And it's important to be respectful of those. But I will step out of the cultural appropriation argument because I'll get myself in trouble. Okay, so then this is going to get us into chapter 13 with the Exodus itself. For some reason, and maybe it's from the movies I watched, it felt like there was my memory of the Exodus was more grand when it actually happens. And this felt like more just reading about them kind of slipping out when it happens. But there is a lot of emphasis on how they are to retell this story and the rituals that are going to be along with that. And so a couple of those is the consecration of the firstborn. So all of the firstborn of the animals are to be saved for sacrifice, and the firstborn son was to be set aside for different priestly duties and such. They're going to talk more about unleavened bread, and then they're going to talk about the way that they leave Egypt to get to Israel. And so when you're in Egypt here, remember they're in the land of Goshen, you would think they would just go this way. They're trying to get to the promised land. But it says they don't go that way because they don't want to go through the land of the Philistines. Just in case you're curious, the land of the Philistines is up here, and they don't exist yet. I just want to point that out. But they end up going this way. And that's important because they're going to come down here to Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, which is all the way down here. I've always thought that Sinai was somewhere over in Egypt. In Israel. But nope, it's all the way down there. And this is important because most of the rest of Exodus is going to happen around Mount Sinai, this holy mountain. And this is going to also get us kind of close to the land of Midian. That is where Moses left. So he left Egypt, came to Midian. His father-in-law is a Midianite. There's some other significance to Midians in relation to the Israelites that we won't get in here too, but if you want to look up some fun scholarly things, you can look that up. But here they're going to march through here. I want to point this out. I thought this was cool, and I got this from this sheet. This is from Rice University. It is a explanation of the 10 plagues and their significance, and then the relation to some of the different Egyptian gods. It might be a little bit repetitive, but I would recommend this. I think it's the second to last page. It has about the death of the firstborn and its significance with Pharaoh and stuff. But they say that this afterwards, that there are these instructions that they're given, and we know them as the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Law of the Firstborn. And that these three rituals or these three feasts, they're going to displace the law of sacrifice. So in Passover, the law of the gospel in the unleavened bread, and then the law of consecration with the law of the firstborn. I thought that was cool, and they explained that in more detail. Any questions about this map?
I thought it looks like a long distance for Moses to be in Egypt, go to Midian, and then go back and take everybody out.
Yeah. Well, one thing to remember too is that traditionally, so he spends 40 years here, and then 40 years out here, and then 40 years that they are going to wander before they get back. So they had a lot of time to move pretty slowly.
Numbers.
Yeah, and that makes a nice round. 40 years are another set of kind of special numbers. Another part I'll point out, so one of the questions we have is how could they cross through the Red Sea? So some of your translations might make a note with the Sea of Reeds. And one of the crossing point, the Sea of Reeds is over here. And so in one of these two spots, there's a thinner layer of the Sea of Reeds. If you really want to think about where a crossing might have happened. Okay, you remember this song?
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to kind of close with this song and listen to the other verses. And I really hope it gets stuck in your head. Because it's going to explain more of what we're reading about. All right, there we go. I hope that chorus gets stuck in your head. It was one that I grew up reading. So this is what we read today. So next week we're not going to read chapters 13 through 17. It's going to be our special break week, right? Yeah, because it's it'll be the fourth Thursday next week.
So break week, meaning we do not convene.
We will meet,
Okay.
and we'll have a special topic. And so, but we will not. We'll have a break on Exodus while I get caught up on my notes, and we'll have a special topic.
That's fair enough.
He's going to teach us how to walk like an Egyptian.
No, so my question is there any special burning Bible topic that you want? If there's not a burning topic, I'm going to do my Proverbs lesson, which is the one I was going to do before we started Exodus, but I think I was sick or something. But if there's other burning topics, so once a month we'll take an Exodus break while I get caught up on outlining it, and we'll do a special topic, and it kind of breaks it up a little bit.
Do we need to read Proverbs then or something? Or?
It might be good if we do the Proverbs one. Bring in your favorite proverb.
Oh dear.
Bill?
Well, I'm a cradle Episcopalian, okay? And every Sunday I listen to the sermon, which is often based on the scripture for the day, particularly the lecture or the gospel. But what has always concerned me is I say to myself, do these priests see and have any empathy for all the suffering in the world? And if they do, why aren't we hearing about it from the pulpit? And it just bothers me. They may be immersed in ministry, they may be immersed in outreach, but I'm not hearing it. I'm not hearing where we fit in. We prosperous, hugely blessed people. Where do we fit into this terrible suffering in the world? And you know, just reading, I mean, this is all metaphorical and symbolic, but there are 10 plagues today too. And I'm not hearing it from the pulpit. Now that may not be an appropriate subject at all for next week. Next Thursday. But I just had to say that because maybe Billy will change that trend, but it concerns me.
Yeah. So there is a big theology where it's called theodicy, which is the justice of God. So what do we do with a world with suffering if we're supposed to have a good God and a powerful God? And so either God is not powerful enough, good enough to want to change the world, but not powerful enough to change it, or God is powerful enough to change it, but not good enough to change it in a good way. And that is a topic that we could look at, as well as what about our connection into working in the world. And we can
about outreach.
Different outreach things, and actually it might be a good thing to share with what this church is doing. So the youth this Saturday are going to go serve at Fish Pantry. We have a very large segment that Ascension's connected with Justice Knox that are doing things here in this community. Coming up on a Sunday night, we are partnering with another diocese in Africa, in Kondoa. Does anybody know that Kondoa? They take the pilgrimage every year there. But there is a lot of things that Ascension is connected with and doing. But that service and outreach is one of those things that some churches do better than others, and at different times do better than other churches as well.
And what's interesting is if you look around the table, there are several of us who are involved in specific outreach. I could speak to Justice Knox, someone else, Fish. So that may be something that identifying something that's going on that's not happening or happening in our community and taking some responsibility to identify it and work towards making things better.
Yeah, because it's funny when you're saying that Ascension of the Episcopal churches in this area is one of the most active churches in service locally and abroad. And that's not just true in the present, it's been true for a number of years for Ascension. Even so much as, I don't know if you know the history about Fish, but like Ascension had raised a bunch of money to expand, and when the church split, that expansion didn't need to happen anymore. So they had all this money, and they're like, well, what do we want to do with it? And so the church was like, we'll donate it to help build out Fish Pantry, the warehouse, which is still run from this church and is the largest food pantry in East Tennessee. And it's one that was started and is still, it's just right down the hallway right here.
There's no question that Fish is a wonderful ministry, and it's a unique ministry. And I support that in every way. And maybe